Thank you for joining Direct Women's webinar on Breaking into the Corporate Boardroom, the Pathways and the Process. My name is Kelsey Velma, and I'll be your technical moderator behind the scenes. I'm the Director of Programs and Operations here at Direct Women, and I'm excited to be hosting this session. Before we get started, I'd like to run through a few housekeeping notes. You should all be able to see the screen right now and hear my voice. The phone lines, however, are muted, so although all of you can hear me, we cannot hear you. That said, you can still ask questions, and we encourage you to do so. At the top right of your screen is the GoToWebinar panel. Just open the console, find the question section, type your question, and hit submit. Please feel free to submit questions at any time. Today's webinar will be approximately 1 hour with 40 minutes of content followed by 15 minutes for Q&A. Our speakers' biographies are available for download in the handout section of the GoToWebinar console. Lastly, there will be a short survey at the end of the webinar that we hope you will complete. It is only 4 questions and should take no more than 2 to 3 minutes tops. With that, I would like to turn it over to the moderator of today's program, Yen Chu. Yen?
Thank you, Kelsey. Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining this Direct Women discussion on the pathways and processes for breaking into the corporate boardroom. I'm Yen Chu, and I have the honor of being the moderator for today's program. I'm currently the Chief Legal Officer of Equinox Holdings, where I oversee legal and government affairs. I was introduced to Direct Women as a member of its class of 2018 Board Institute. I've recently joined Direct Women's Board of Directors to help advance Direct Women's mission to increase the representation of women lawyers on corporate boards. Over the past 14 years, Direct Women's work includes identifying leading women lawyers from around the country who are able to provide the experience, independence, and business judgment required for board effectiveness. Through our various programs, Direct Women develops and positions women attorney leaders for board service. We also serve as a resource for companies seeking qualified women board candidates. I am pleased to have panelists Mike Petters, Daisha Kelly, and Sarah Spearing here with me today. And it is my pleasure to introduce this esteemed panel, all of whose bios are so long that I could spend the entire session talking about them, but you have them downloaded as Kelsey had mentioned. Each of them with a different role and perspective on the corporate boardroom. Mike Petters is President and CEO of Huntington Ingalls Industries, America's largest military shipholding company and provider of professional services to partners in the government and industry. He is also a member of Huntington Ingalls Board of Directors. Daisha Kelly is a Senior Advisor to Executive Director of Library Piper. She is a 2012 alumna of the Direct Women Board Institute and a director of surveying in 2 public companies, Ingalls Industries and Owens, Illinois, Inc. Sarah is a partner in the Global Board of Directors, Chief Executive Officers, and Industrial Practices at Heidrick & Struggles. Thank you all for being here today. I'm going to start the moderated discussion with a topic that is near and dear to all of us, the increasingly diverse board. In recent years, there have been several studies from McKinsey to Boston Consulting Group to all sorts of studies that reinforce that there's a correlation between diversity and a company's financial performance. This has resulted in a number of significant actions, such as California being the first state to pass a law mandating that every public company has at least 1 woman on its board, to Goldman Sachs announcing they won't take a company public unless there's a woman or a person of color on the board, and recently NASDAQ filing a proposal with the SEC requiring companies to explain why they don't have at least 2 diverse candidates, including a woman or an LGBTQ+ candidate. In addition, there continues to be pressure from all stakeholders, whether it be institutional investors, consumers, special interest groups, etc., for diversity on boards. The first question is to invite Mike to share with us a little bit about his company. Huntington Ingalls has 36% women and 18% diversity members on its board. Mike, can you share with us a little bit about the company's commitment and your own personal commitment to board diversity?
Sure, and thanks for having me here today, and I thank Stacia for helping me get this prestigious seat on this panel. I'm very honored to be here. You know, to me, board diversity and diversity inclusion in the corporation they're not separable issues. They're the same, they're just different faces of the same issue. And, you know, I'll start by saying we've been 10 years now public. I think our 10th anniversary is the end of this month. Stacia was on our board from the very beginning. And she's been a leader for us in thinking our way through, you know, board participation as well as what's going on in the company with our diverse programs and the things that we need to do. You know, I had a bit of a, you know, a coming to Damascus moment about 6 or 7 years ago when we were doing our leadership review inside the company, and one of my leaders was saying, we were talking about diversity. We've been tracking it for years and years and years, a couple of decades, frankly. I mean, I've been in the business now 33 years. I heard this leader telling me the almost exact same things that I said when I had that job, you know, 20 years ago. And there hadn't really been any change. And so that sort of motivated me to, if we keep doing the same thing over and over again, we're going to keep getting the same results. If we're going to change this, we got to go do something different. So we began a kind of an all leaders on deck approach to D&I. Every meeting that I have, we talk about diversity and inclusion. If I get all of my leaders together at an offsite, we spend about 25 to 30% of our time on the topic of diversity. We've made it a central issue, and I made it a personal commitment that as long as I'm around, we're going to talk about this and we're going to go act on it. And even this year, we actually brought an incentive into our compensation structure for diversity inside the organization, and we've made great progress. And I reserve the right to be very impatient with that. What I have learned in that journey is that diversity is not it's not a program that can be delegated. I think leaders have to actually own this themselves. And they have to recognize, and they don't really get to own it. You know, typically a leader has a problem or something to work on, they delegate the authority to somebody to go create a program to solve that. Diversity is not a program; it's a mindset and a culture. So that means it has to be led by the most senior folks in the organization. And if the organization doesn't see you actually walking the talk, your credibility gets shot. I mean, the gap between who you say you are and who you actually are, who they see you are, the size of that gap is the weakness in your credibility with your leadership team. So you can talk about diversity all you want, but if your board's not diverse, if your senior leadership team is not diverse, if your business unit leadership teams are not diverse, then you're not being consistent, and people will see it for what it is. I'm very proud to say we have 3 business units in our company today. 2 of the 3 business units, we just announced one of our business leaders is retiring, and 2 of our 3 business units leaders now are women. And these are the 2 shipbuilding businesses. And shipbuilding does not really have a reputation for being it has sort of a legacy of being a very macho kind of business. But these leaders have actually excelled throughout their careers. I've known both of them for more than a decade. In fact, the president of our operation Newport News I've known for 30 years. And she has been a visionary leader for her whole career. And the president we just picked for our other shipyard, I've known her for 15, and he has been the same. So, you know, when leaders start to realize that diversity is actually an asset in the resume, then you can own this and really drive it in the organization. And when you think about board skills, diversity as a skill to bring to the board is critically important. And so we've been committed to it from the beginning. And I think you know, we didn't need Goldman to tell us or Larry Fink or anybody else to tell us to do this. We were way out in front of this. And I'll stop right there.
That's fantastic. I think it's clear tone at the top is important, and having the diversity within your company speaks volumes. Stacia, as a member as a board member for Huntington Ingalls, can you elaborate on your experience with that board as well as the others that you are on? You know that you've been a board member for quite some time.
Sure, and thank you again for having me. So let me go back in history a little bit because I've been on boards long enough and certainly on the OI board long enough to actually see and watch this dramatic evolution. Can't call it a revolution, but you can call it an evolution. And you know, to me, saying that diversity of thought, of experience, of gender, of background, it makes a business better. You think it's a no-brainer, and then the connection of that to the business performance of a company with diverse populations, both on the board and in management, is successful, is also a bit of a no-brainer now that we articulate it. But obviously that was not always the case. So there was no path when I first was approached to go on a board. But when I was getting ready for this, I had sort of an epiphany about this particular board. So Owens, Illinois is the largest manufacturer of glass packaging in the world. Very male intensive, Midwest company. And it was, when I was invited to join the board, it was a KKR portfolio company. And so they were looking for directors who would go with the company when it went public. Now, I clearly was not there because I was a woman. There was nothing about this job that said they wanted a woman or, frankly, a lawyer. But for me, and this is the interesting part of it, I think when I look back on it, I realize that I came to KKR because of the recommendation of a former colleague of mine at Fannie Mae who was a woman, and she knew someone on the board. So hold that thought for when we talk about networking, because even though I didn't know that's what it was and that I had been the beneficiary of networking, I certainly was. But the company itself was a very, as I say, very intensive manufacturing company, and they were not at all prepared for women. So I'll just tell you this very quick story about the CEO, because I think it's one of my best CEO stories. When I sat down with him, both of us from New England, he had no idea what to talk to me about. He literally didn't have a clue. And the only commonality we had was knowing Boston. And the only commonality within that was knowing, and this is important for those of you who care about statistics and trivia, we both knew the capacity of the old Boston Gardens. Just in case anyone's interested, it's 14,448, used to be. But I mean, that's how dramatically different we were. And so we got through that. And I realized in retrospect also that I took a risk, obviously, to go on this board. There was no due diligence. I mean, you didn't have that in those days to begin with, and it was a portfolio company, you know, but I figured it was a calculated risk because KKR obviously is a very well-respected company. The business was solid, and I knew that taking this risk would make sense for me. Another piece of that lesson, I think, is being able to take that calculated risk, because you're not always going to get an opportunity to be on Microsoft's board or, you know, Apple's board, or a place that you would seem to be a no-brainer, at least until recently. But this was something that I had to consider. I had to take a risk on. Now, that has changed even within OI. I was the only woman on that board for 15 years. And now we have, and I want to say a word about this later, Sarah, to the role of the executive recruiter. Now we have 3 women on our board, including the chair, and we get another one hopefully in the pipeline. So that's a huge evolution. I would say with Huntington Ingalls, but as Mike outlined his commitment to diversity, it was a very different world. Although I will say the diversity, Mike, you'll remember this, the diversity at the beginning when we talked about diversity on the HII board was anyone who didn't go to the Naval Academy. So I fit that on a couple of fronts. But Huntington Ingalls and Mike's diversity commitment, both at the board level and at the senior management level, obviously comes through in his passionate description. It also comes through in the numbers. And both in the boardroom and then with our 2 of our 3 businesses being now led by women. So I think that speaks for itself. But so those are my experiences, very different experiences of getting onto those boards. And to round that out, I would just say that this is, as I said at the beginning of my response here, this is hopefully a slow and painful evolution that is about to become a revolution. And I think we're seeing that based on what you described earlier, Yen. I think we're seeing that, and it's very positive and encouraging.
I agree. I love the part about taking risks. And I think that's from the candidate perspective, but I would love to hear from Sarah talking a little bit about from the recruiter perspective in terms of companies reaching out and looking at non-executive board members and the focus on diversity and the risk that they're taking, because it's not always the same candidates over and over again.
Yeah. No, that's exactly right. And I'll echo the thanks for having me here. You know, when I think about boards diversifying, I think about it in two sort of subjects. One, the substance of the candidate, and two, how it's affected the process, you know, to Stacia's point about the revolution. On substance, you know, we're challenging our boards and the boards are challenging themselves to say, how are we actually defining this skill set? So if a client comes to me and says, I need a CEO on the board, we take a step back and we say, well, let's break that down. Is it that you want somebody who's held a P&L? Then we can think about divisional leaders. Is it that you want great gravitas? We can think about academics, government, community leaders. It's really about sort of parsing that out, because the more that we can widen that aperture in terms of how we're defining the skills, the more we can hit diversity. If we can give a little bit on that, then we can stay really, really tightly focused on the diversity side. So I think that there is a, you know, very sincere movement on boards to move away from defining the skills just by title and be more thoughtful about what actual experiences those titles might represent. And then on the process point, I mean, to Stacia's point, you know, particularly since the summer, you know, with the George Floyd killing, the appetite on boards, rightly so, for diversity, particularly ethnic diversity, has just skyrocketed. I think in the last, you know, what has it been, 10, 11 months, probably 90% of my board clients have either come out of the gate saying we need a diverse candidate specifically, or we've been going down a path and they've shifted. I think rightly so. And, you know, it's done a lot to the process because obviously that has increased the demand. The processes are moving very, very quickly for candidates. I mean, oftentimes I will talk to diverse executives who are getting 5 or 10 inbounds for boards a week, which is, you know, pretty extraordinary. I'll tell a little story. I had just a fantastic candidate. She was a Black female executive. I was introducing her to a consumer business, a great size, great trajectory. It was probably a $20 billion company. She was ready to go in and take the meetings, called me the night before and said, Sarah, I'm so sorry, I can't go through with this. In the last 48 hours, I've been approached, have been introduced to 5 directors, and have gotten an offer from a Fortune 50 board. So, you know, it just sort of shows you how quickly it's moving, which is a great thing. But again, we're having to continue to challenge ourselves to keep that pool open, because it can't just be the same handful of even diverse folks that we're thinking about here as we go.
Yeah, 100%. It makes me think that, you know, obviously one of the key challenges in getting that first board seat has always been that catch-22 on title, and people looking for board candidates who have had prior board candidates. So you're looking at the same pool constantly. And as Sarah noted, boards have often sought sitting CEOs or CFOs for board seats, and that kind of perpetuates the diversity issue. One of the things that over the years that I've noticed that's trying to change that conversation in terms of an evolution, not quite a revolution, as Stacia puts it so apt, is the board skills matrix. That matrix has become an important tool, I think, over the years in terms of increasing diversity, not just in terms of looking at gender or race, et cetera, but expanding the board's composition in areas of technical skills and expertise. And I think that has allowed for the prominence of lawyers as board candidates as well, the skill sets that lawyers bring. Stacia, I would love to hear from you a little bit about how much of a role industry or subject matter has played for you in getting on a board. You're into, and I think the industrial sector, which has, as you noted, been predominantly male or from the Naval Academy only. I think that it's really interesting, but how much of some of the the experience you've had as a lawyer has played a role in getting on boards.
Right. So thank you for that. It was funny when I first started thinking about the answer to this question, my first response was going to be, well, I don't actually really think I didn't have any industry experience either in manufacturing or shipbuilding. So that didn't seem to me to be part of the equation. But then I thought, and I think this is the really important point for our audience at Direct Women, is how we think of ourselves as lawyers is like this narrow. So you can look at the board matrix, but you got to get the director to sort of understand how to describe their own skill sets in a way that is non-traditional and hasn't been used over the years. So when we think about ourselves as lawyers, so many CEOs, Mike, I would exclude you from this, would say over the years, and many in boardrooms I've been in as a general counsel, great candidate, but I got a lawyer, I got a general counsel, I don't need another lawyer, right? And we've had to fight that for a long time, but we're way, way, way more than lawyers. Lawyers are obviously trained analytical thinkers, but they're trained to do the kinds of things that boards are responsible for, which is overseeing risk management, which is crisis management, which is finding resolutions to issues of broad interest across the board to the company, and then even beyond that. So I think with our Direct Women audience, understanding that and understanding how to describe our experience and our background is really critical. And I know I have one little story about this. I know that when we have the Direct Women class, we have sessions where we train with folks to redo their resume and then have a elevator speech. So why would you want to be a board member and tell in the space in the time of a long elevator ride, right? And I was working with one young woman who was she was a GC at a pretty good sized company, and she's going through her resume and she gets to the very end and she says, oh yeah, and by the way, I started a software company when I was like 20 years ago. I'm like, no, you shouldn't end it with that. That's how you begin, because it's that skill set you had coming out of law school that drove you to do that you then built on. So understanding that it's not just subject matter or industry expertise, but it's what we bring more broadly as women for sure, but clearly as lawyers, in this case, both of that combination is very important.
I agree. Sarah, any kind of key areas of expertise that boards are really hitting up for these days, highlighting, whether it be, e-commerce or cybersecurity expertise or risk management in general, any of those in particular, in your view as an executive search firm, how does a lawyer position themselves? Very much as Stacia said, your resume for a job as a general counsel or at a law firm partner is very different than one for a board position.
Yeah. No, I think that there are some particular areas of depth that we're seeing boards be more thoughtful about. And, back to Stacia's point, I would echo that, all day. I mean, I think that's exactly right. I always tell board candidates, think of a way to model your background using a capital letter T. So what is the area of depth that you are bringing, which I think for a lot of lawyers, and I'm an ex-lawyer, so I can do this with myself, can pretty quickly hone in on. I think that where it gets tough, to Stacia's point, is that breadth. And so how can you demonstrate through your experiences that whatever the situation in the boardroom, you'll be there to add value. And for lawyers in particular, it can be going through, an exercise of figuring out where you were a strategic partner to your CEO, when you were in the boardroom and the exposure that you had there and how you interfaced. Just some of those things to help broaden out, I think is exactly right. And then I think there actually are a couple of pretty interesting trends that we'll see continuing that would fit really nicely for legal backgrounds. The first is ESG, and it's, one of those umbrella terms now, like technology, that can mean and does quite a bit of things. But so many of my clients are, again, defining that for themselves, thinking about how it's important to them as an organization. And then that will often lead to what particular skill sets could be helpful with respect to the board. So last year I added my first chief sustainability officer to a board, a female, which was fantastic. Has not been my last and won't be. Oftentimes you'll see those issues, particularly on the people side, on the S side of the equation, rolling up through general counsels or somewhere across the function. So where folks with legal backgrounds or general counsels are holding on to those pieces, that can be incredibly helpful to boards and certainly worth highlighting. And then the other piece, and this is another broad one that we've seen, especially through 2020, is transformation. There's not a company that will say today, oh, no, we're not going through any transformation. And so, again, it's sort of table stakes for a board member. Can you come in and show, not that you necessarily have the deep crisis management expertise, but have you been through some tough stuff, and do you have some scar tissue so that you can come in and just really help add a balanced perspective of somebody who's lived through some things. That I think is hard to define, but is incredibly helpful in the boardroom, especially through, a crazy year like 2020.
It's so great to have you highlight those things. So many of us live through those things and don't even realize, right? So everybody goes through transformation. You don't realize what you've actually done through that transformation. You hit on one key term that I would love to expand on with Mike a little bit, which is a strategic partner to the CEO. I think that is huge. A good relationship between the CEO and the board, especially the non-executive members of the board, is essential. While the board's role is oversight, we know, and not day-to-day management, oftentimes those lines can seem really blurry as you're in there and trying to handle a lot of the crisis management or look at the company's future, particularly during transformation times or innovation times. From the CEO's perspective, Mike, can you share what characteristics in a board member you believe would make a successful relationship, working with your board and elaborating a little bit more in terms of the constant communication?
Well, sure. I think I'm going to kind of go back a little bit. As we were part of Northrop Grumman and we were getting ready to spin out of Northrop, we had to form a board. We had to do all of the things that you need to do to become a public company that is different from just being an operating division. So I went off. I took a couple of my members of my team, and we went up to Harvard, and we went through their Making Boards Effective course, different aspects of it. But I would say I walked out of that program with two very strong convictions. And 10 years later, I think that while I can add on to this, I would not back away from these two things. The first thing that I saw was that in every single case study that we had that involved boards and management teams, whether it was a compensation issue or an operating issue or an audit issue, whatever the issue was, if you kept peeling the onion back, sooner or later you got to a place where there was a disconnect between the board and the management team on strategy. If they're not aligned on strategy, the wrong people get hired, the wrong decisions get made, and they blow up in your face. And so I kind of came away from that and said, whatever else we do, we have to make sure that there is no air gap between what strategy the management team is trying to execute and what strategy the board has approved. And we have a very deep and thorough strategic process, and if we are the least bit misaligned, we go back and work on it to make sure that there's just no gap between the board and management. Second thing is that I came out of there with was that I was in a class with 50. I was a prospective CEO in that class, but most everybody else in the class were board members. And during the breaks and over dinner and everything, when I would talk to them about the boards they were on, their single most important source of frustration was that the CEO was a choke point for information. That they didn't know anything about the company unless the CEO told them. And so, again, I came back with a conviction, we're not going to do that. We're going to have a high bandwidth of communication between the leadership team and the board. And so there is, on any given day, there is a robust communication going on between my leaders and the board that I may know about, but I might find out about later. And there's certainly no attempt on my part to try to edit that or filter that or censor that. And the reason I say those two things, and we could go and start talking about ESG and governance and these other things. I think as a board candidate, you can get really wrapped up in how do I present myself in the strongest possible light. But trying to understand what that light is probably useful. Boards are trying to figure out how do they get better communication with management, how do they manage strategy. If you can present yourself as someone who actually has experience in those things, then that's going to be exceptionally useful to an effective board. A lot of boards out there that are not terribly effective, and they may not understand that and understand the value you would bring them. And I think you would have a chance to think about whether you really wanted to join that board. But if you want to be on an effective board, those are the things that effective boards are going to get right. So we put energy into that, and I hope as you're thinking about whether it's a T kind of a thought or how you present yourself, the breadth of your experiences, think about it also as what are the boards looking for? What are the things that they need to have to do their job? And those are the two things that I think they have to be effective.
That absolutely. So it's clear that a successful board should have members that work well together and with management to complement each other. So chemistry is important. Chemistry is important in a lot of different things. And it's why many boards tend to draw from their own network, which can be a little challenging when there's a vacancy that the same people, again, we go back to the issue of the same candidate pool. Getting that first corporate board seat's not always easy. It's tough for anyone, and it's especially tough for women who may not have the established network that many men do. So Stacia, how did you build your network? Once you made that decision that you wanted to join a board and you had your elevator pitch down, and you thought, okay, how did you build that network? And I think you alluded to it at the very beginning. We'd love to hear that story.
So yes, so networking is like my favorite subject of all when it comes to what we're talking about now and direct women. So I don't know, I was a born networker. I'm not sure exactly where it came from in my Irish Catholic background, but I have always loved not just networking, but connecting people. So that's a principle of mine that I never started to get a board seat per se, but just because I thought networking made sense and I enjoyed doing it. Now, as you mentioned, until very recently, board members would come from other sitting board members. The candidates would come in, and that makes perfect sense because the chemistry, the directors know the chemistry, they know who they're recommending, and so that's a fairly easy process. But that is now changing, and I think that's great. And Sarah, to the point I was going to make with you is the role of the executive recruiters now is very, very important, and way more important than it was when you didn't have a pool of diverse candidates and you didn't able to present that diverse pool to folks. So networking to me, and I have some principles of networking that I would like to share because I think it's really important, but I don't think you should get all jumbled up in it as either, if that's all you're doing is networking. So it clearly is a way to establish yourself and develop relationships with people, both in your own little sphere, your own little world, but more importantly, outside that little world. So one of the mistakes I think we make as women and as lawyers is that we don't realize how extensive our network really is. So it's not just our colleagues, it's not just our fellow lawyers that we go to dinner with at the ABA, it is people like Mike Petters and colleagues in our C-suite circumstances, other directors of other companies. That's part of the network. There's nothing wrong with using that network to the extent that you can to ask for help, right? Not something that women are particularly good at doing, broadening themselves out and approaching people they don't know, but that's something you got to do if you're going to network. It's never too early to network. I mean, I didn't start networking for a job or a board seat, certainly. But again, I started networking because I just wanted my world to be larger. I wanted my universe to be better. And I wanted to learn from people that I didn't look like me and didn't sound like me. So networking is do it early and often, as they say in Chicago. And then so think about networking as part of not just a business endeavor, but your life. You know, people always talk with women about, particularly women lawyers, about work-life balance, right? I hate that term because it's not work and life. It's like, it's all life. So similarly with networking, you should only really be networking with people you like. I mean, life is too short to spend a lot of time with people that you don't like or respect. So that makes it easier to network because you're not going to like everyone, but you're not using people just to use them. You're doing it because you like them. So I think that's a very important point. And then, so I have to tell a story that embarrasses me, but Mike, I don't even know if you know this story, but the other point I would say is networking is not just all about us or you. It's also about the connections and making and providing opportunities for people in your network that you wouldn't necessarily think of. So when after I think 2 years on the board, we were looking for another director, and one of our directors who is associated with the University of Virginia Business School gave Mike a list of people, and all of whom were women. Well, one of them was my best friend in the world who I'd worked with at MCI WorldCom. And why didn't I come up with that name? Why didn't I say, wait, she's a CFO, she's not a lawyer. She's a CFO, she's great, she's been a fabulous director. But so we've got to look at how we are networking other people in our network the same way that we want to be networked by them into ours. I have told that story to Victoria, so I'm only embarrassed because I still can't understand why I didn't come up with it in the first place, but you know, it's real. So network. I think that's a really important part of what we're all about and how we lay the foundation for not only board seats, but career moves. I think we lost Yen.
Yeah, I think we did lose him. I think I'm having some internet issues, and I apologize. I'm trying to redial in, but I am on the phone. So okay. I would love to continue the conversation in terms of, you know, I agree, network. And I think people talk about that a lot. Mike, from the CEO perspective, what would you advise the audience in terms of building a board-ready network?
Well, first of all, I'm not sure I can add a whole lot of value to what Stacia just said. I mean, I think she kind of hit it on the head. All I would say is that when you see the word network, think the word relationship. And relationships take, you know, two people. And it's hard to create a relationship when you need something. It's easy to create a relationship when there's no, you know, when there's no pressure, or you can work on something together. And so, you know, I think, first of all, I'd say Stacia is exceptionally good at this. And both of us know our former chairman may have been the best person I've ever known in this regard, because if you ever placed a phone call to him for any reason, you were in his network for the rest of your life. You know, and he would invest time in it. And one thing that I believe is that people can see what you care about by how you invest your time. He would invest time in his network. We always thought he was just, you know, how does he know that person, and how does he get involved in that? You know, but it was because he would, if you spend any time with him, he would be with you, but then he would be investing in his network too. And that's an inspiration for all of us, is that it's about relationships and trying to build strong personal relationships, because you just never know where that bridge is going to be something that will be valuable to you or to the person that you're building the relationship with. And I think I'll stop there and let Stacia's comments stand.
Yen? I guess she's having Definitely having problems. So, being the shy, retiring person that I am, we have one more area to cover, and so let me find it, and maybe I'll just pop the question out so that we can.
I think, Stacia, I think I've got it, and I think it's one for you. So maybe I'll give it to you, and we'll run it that way.
Okay, great.
I think it's rounding out sort of the process and what that looks like, and I can talk a little bit about it from a search firm's perspective. But I think first, asking you, when did you start thinking about board service? You've touched on this a little bit, but thinking about how you sort of laid the groundwork and thought from a process perspective, some of the pieces along the way that would make sense.
Yeah, so I think that the networking as a concept that we're doing now and the connections is something that it's great that it's articulated now. I didn't really have that term in my vocabulary at the time that I was looking for either my next job or necessarily a board seat. And then I was very lucky to have been chosen for both of my boards, and both of them came through the old-fashioned way, which was a suggestion or recommendation from another director on that board. I guess I would say, and this is a little bit off topic, but I think it's an important point to make given what we're talking about with connections and networking, is one of the things I've always been careful with is I want to make sure I maintain my integrity and my reputation through the people that I recommend to recruiters, particularly in job searches and others. So I have a lot of people who come to me asking for help because I know I'm connected with, you guys, Sarah and Lee Hansen and all those good people who've been part of my life for years. But I'm not going to present someone to you that I'm not proud to present. And so that does require a little bit of digging and making sure. If someone comes to me recommended, that's from somebody I trust, and that makes that very easy. But making sure that your own credibility is maintained is great. And then again, just another little side story. When I first started doing this mentoring and networking and laying the foundation mostly for others to get these positions, somebody said to me, you know what, you're sending all these people to the headhunters, the executive recruiters. You should be getting a fee. I mean, maybe you should be getting a commission. And I thought, wow, for about 30 seconds. And then I said, well, that would completely destroy my credibility in the people who I'm recommending. So why would anybody believe my recommendations if they're paying me, $15,000 or $20,000 to get named? So that quickly went out the window, although I did think for a moment that there was some attractiveness to that. But so that is my story is more about not my laying the foundation, because I didn't even know I was doing it. I really didn't. But laying it for other people and then teaching other people that it's their responsibility to pay it forward, as they say, especially with women and especially with women lawyers whose possibilities have always been a little more narrow than they would otherwise be.
So speaking of connection, I lost connection and I apologize. I hope you can all hear me now. I think that's I agree. I think it's wonderful to always help others, but also just to ensure the credibility of who you are putting forth, and in terms of standards and in terms of making sure that it is the best candidate. Sarah, can you talk a little bit more from the process standpoint?
Yeah, no, absolutely. It's interesting, and I think there's a lot actually that ties into why the process that I sort of run is the way it is, based on, a lot of history that we've talked about. But, first and foremost, we know that we've got to get the skills right. That's sort of table stakes, as we've talked about, but it is that cultural piece. I mean, that's incredibly important. And so on any board search, we're spending the first 4 or 5 weeks with the board, getting to know those people, getting to know the chemistry, the dynamics, et cetera, along with the skills and learning about the business. But it's incredibly critical to make sure that we're not just finding the right background on paper, but we're finding somebody who can either acclimate in that situation or, be a change agent if that's what we're talking about. So, typically it will be, as I said, month and a half before I'm even out picking up the phone, calling somebody. And all that's to say, when I do, it's a very select group of folks that we're calling because, again, we've done so much diligence with the company on the front end. And we've also talked about potential backgrounds on the front end because we want to see if we're getting it right with real folks. And we want to, to Stacia's point about the connection that you have to Victoria, we want to know if somebody knows this person well, let's understand those relationships and reference points and connection points so that we can think about it in the right way and all sort of lock arms together and attack this. So, if somebody's getting a call about a particular board from an executive recruiter, it's fair to say that it's probably a pretty small group that's actually getting those calls. I think the piece, though, that I would add and double click on is, with respect to diligence, because we're doing diligence on the board side. This process is also made so that candidates are doing their diligence, and they should. There's plenty I think that candidates should think about as they go through things. But, by virtue of having a conversation with me, by virtue of meeting with, Mike as CEO or other directors of a board, you're not locked in. You're not saying I'm absolutely doing this, just as a board is, of course, going through their process, albeit on a, small and very focused scale. So I do think that we've gotten better about giving room on both sides to explore, converse, due diligence, as opposed to, I remember, not even 10 years ago where I was setting up a dinner between the CEO on a board and a potential candidate. And, the candidate thought that he was going to get an offer at that dinner and sort of huffed away because he didn't. So, we're sort of gone from those days, which I think is important because, it's just clear that everybody should be really thoughtful on both sides because these are, multi-year commitments, certainly speak to personal reputation, et cetera. And so we want everybody to take them really seriously.
I do want to give our audience some time for questions. So before we do that, I'd like to just have everybody give any kind of last minute advice to our attendees and with respect to considering corporate board of service. I'll start with Mike. Any last piece of advice or anything to share?
Yeah, I guess, and this may be more reflective of the most recent conversation that Stacia and Sarah. I think that if you're going to go on a board, I think it's really important that you do your own diligence about the board. And I think you have to, even if it means not taking your first board seat, if you're not excited to be there, and excited about what they're trying to do, and excited about your role to be able to help them do what they're trying to do and help them lead that, you're going to go on that board. You'll be a board member and you'll kind of be in the club, but your reputation, you won't bring as much energy to it. And your personal reputations can take a hit. I get asked to be on a lot of nonprofit boards. You can imagine we're the largest employer in 2 states, and the phone rings all the time. And while I believe deeply in all of the things that people are calling me to do, I have to say no a lot, and it's mainly because either I don't have the bandwidth to do that job the way that it needs to be done, or I'm just not terribly excited about it. And if I'm not terribly excited about it, I don't have time in my life to go and just go through the motions. And so I think it's really important, and maybe even more important for your first board than any board after that, is to make sure that when you go to your first board that you're really excited about what they're trying to do, who they are, who they want to be, what your place in that's going to be, so that you will bring your best self to that effort. Because if you don't, you'll be a board member, true, but it will kind of hang with you a little bit. So that's my thought.
Very valuable. I think it goes back to what we said at the beginning, know why you're doing what you're doing. Just because it's prestigious to be on a board doesn't mean that it's the right thing for someone to do or the right board for that person. So it's a very nice reminder for everyone. You only get one shot at your reputation. Stacia, any last minute advice for our attendees?
Thanks. I would build, I think Mike's absolutely right. And it goes back to one of the points we were talking about before. Getting to know the directors on a board that you're looking at, not just the chairman and the CEO, but getting to understand the chemistry to the extent you can. And oh, by the way, that old word again, using your network to help you do the due diligence about a company that you might not be able to get otherwise. That, that is something I think that's very important. At the end of the day, there's always a risk, no matter how much you think you know the company or how much you think you know the board. So, but you can't be afraid of risk. I mean, you've got to take calculated risk, and you got to understand what you're doing. You just can't mitigate it all. And that's part of life. I mean, there are times when that happens, and Mike, I think you've seen it over your career. I've seen it over mine, when a director doesn't work out for what other reason. And always better when that happens to go do another board, to not continue the pain both for the rest of the board and for you, but recognizing that yourself and acting on it. I think that also helps save your own credibility and personal reputation if you have made a mistake. But mistakes are not fatal. They just have to be managed.
Sarah?
Yeah, I mean, that summary I think was absolutely spot on. I think the other thing I would add to it is, be thoughtful and transparent just about the broad umbrella of capacity. I've had candidates say, and oh, by the way, I've got your board offer, I'm going to take a new job next week. Is that a problem? I mean, sharing some of those things, particularly if you're working with a recruiter, it's incredibly important because it has effects both in terms of how much you can take on, but frankly, just shows that you're being thoughtful overall about the portfolio and what's on your plate, and that, you've got the sophistication of mind to keep all of those components front and center with you.
All right, thank you all. Kelsey, do we have any questions for our panelists?
We most certainly do. We have quite a few here, so we'll try to get to a couple in the next few minutes. Several people have kind of indicated in the question section, they understand the need to build a board-ready network, but they're wondering if our panelists have any specific recommendations for women of color who are looking to secure their first public company board seats.
I'll hop in, and I think others will have comments. I'll say first, just as a blanket note, I can't do my job effectively if I don't know folks who are out there and what they're interested in. So I'm always happy to field questions, field backgrounds, et cetera. We want to make sure that we've got our network as broad as can be. I think the other thing is, take advantage of your network, but particularly as you think about your first public company board, take advantage of your CEO. I think that's going to be an incredibly important relationship because, one, you're going to need their approval to do a board if you've got a CEO, and two, you're going to want to have the advantage of them saying, gosh, this is, such a high potential person as part of their development. It's important to me that they think about a board. That endorsement is incredibly helpful. So I think being thoughtful about some of those first hits in your network can be really important.
And I would add to that because now the diversity factor is becoming so critical and important, and as we know, a lot of the diverse women are getting more offers and more calls than they can possibly handle. Share the wealth. Make sure that you're giving others the ability to have those contacts. I mean, it may not work out, but you're then putting them in a whole different network that they never would have had the opportunity probably to avail themselves on. So again, it's all about broadening out, whether it's for diversity or gender or anything else, to broadening out a network so you have as wide a pool as possible.
I would just add that it's a proactive, this isn't specific to women of color, but I think women of color certainly have a very important opportunity here. But I think that being part of groups like this and being part of other kinds of groups that are either affiliated with your industry or affiliated with corporate leadership at large can be very, very useful. I've seen that work very, very well, especially for candidates of color, both male and female. being part of groups that are specifically focused on that, just like this group is. I think that's very important.
Thank you all. Our next question is to Sarah. How do you source candidates, and what steps do you recommend for evaluating your profile as a first-time candidate for a corporate board?
Mm-hmm. The sourcing, I think, comes from a whole lot of different places. We've already gotten, my 350 partners have great networks all across. So we do a lot of sourcing within our own firm. We do a lot of sourcing with our clients, folks like Mike and Stacia, who we know some great talent who are board ready is incredibly important. And then, as I said, I think getting introductions through trusted sources of folks who are interested, that's always useful because, we know that typically board processes can take a long time. We've seen it accelerate more recently, but given all of that, I think starting to think about it, starting to have some introductory conversations, it's always helpful for us because we can just begin to keep our feelers up and just sort of understand where somebody could be a good fit. So, I think certainly no harm in reaching out to search firms and beginning to have some of those conversations, but even more so doing it through a trusted network can be a nice way to get a good endorsement along the way.
Thank you. I think we have time for one more question here. So this person drew on something that Yen said earlier. She said, Yen touched upon a very good point. The board is looking for experienced candidates to be a board member, which often results in the barrier of entry remaining pretty high for women wishing to be on the board. What does the panel think is the most effective or efficient way to increase the number of women on boards? Is it to encourage companies to take that risk and hire women who might not have prior board experience but are otherwise highly qualified?
Mike, I think that's to you.
Well, I'll start, and then I stand ready to be corrected along this. I actually think that that may have been true more years ago. I think boards are moving forward in a way now where the question of has that person been on another board is not usually about experience. It's usually about chemistry. Is this person going to be someone that will gel with this team, or is it going to be someone that doesn't fit in with this group? And that's my kind of limited experience with this. It's not been, we haven't been reluctant to bring someone on because they didn't have previous board experience. We spent a lot of time vetting our candidates based on what we know about them through our network, and that's not just the board network. That's our overall relationship network. What do we know about those folks? How do they act? How are they going to work in this environment? Are they going to be additive to our effort and have an important role in that, or not? And so that's a narrow view, but that's been my experience. Is that question is usually not about we want somebody with board experience. We want somebody that's going to fit in.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. And it's interesting because I wonder if the questioner was likening that question to a problem that in-house lawyers face all the time when they're looking for their first GC role. Because so many CEOs will say, I want a sitting GC. But and you can understand why that is. And even though having been industry agnostic, I never thought that was very important in my career. But I don't think it's the same, as Mike said. I don't think it's the same dynamic in the boardroom and having to have a prior board, public board experience in order to qualify.
Yeah, and I would just add, there are ways that we can test some of that. It's exposure to the boardroom, but it's also, frankly, working with others on their team. I mean, if you're part of a C-suite, that's a little bit of a microcosm of a board. It's about working with a group and influencing as opposed to managing down on a team. And so it's some of those connection points and references that can be incredibly helpful to understand how they work in a group influential dynamic, that can give a little bit of forecasting about how they would do. And then it's, recognizing if you've got a strong board yourself and you can bring somebody along and coach them and mentor them, then there's a great foundation to bring somebody new.
Okay, well, thank you all. I think that's the last question that we had time for, so I will turn it back over to you, Yen.
Thank you all. I want to thank each of our panelists for being so generous with their time today. We are so grateful for your insights and your perspectives. Very much like how diversity on boards can provide more robust communication and conversation, the different perspectives that each of you brought today has really increased the conversation today and really made it meaningful for our attendees. And I've learned something myself. So to our audience, thank you for listening. We hope you will join us next month as Direct Women has its Power Chat with experienced Corporate Board Director Pamela L. Carter. And again in May for our webinar on Gateway to Corporate Board Service, Demystifying the Experience. Links to register for those programs will be included in the follow-up email from today's webinar and can also be found on Direct Women's website, directwomen.org. Finally, please take a few minutes to provide feedback in a very brief survey that will launch automatically at the end of this live program to help us improve our Direct Women's future virtual program. There's always, as we all navigate this digital world, there's lots to learn. And again, I want to thank you all. Stay safe, stay well, farewell. And thank you again to our panelists.